Journey to the Center of the Earth 1 on the 24th of May 1863, a Sunday, my uncle, Professor Leidenbrock, 4 came rushing back towards his little house at No. 19 Königstrasse, one of the oldest streets in the historic part of Hamburg. Martha the maid must have thought she was running very late, for dinner had hardly begun to simmer on the kitchen range. I said to myself. If my uncle is hungry, he'll shout out his annoyance, for he is the most impatient of men. Professor Leidenbrock here already? Martha exclaimed in amazement, half opening the dining room door. Yes, indeed. But dinner has every right not to be cooked, for it's not 2 o'clock yet. It's only just struck the half hour on St. Michael's. Then why has Professor Leidenbrock come back? Presumably he will tell us. Here he is, I'm off, Master Axel. Point 5. You will make him see reason, won't you? And the good Martha disappeared back into her culinary laboratory. I remained alone. But to make the worst-tempered of professors see reason did not seem possible, given my slightly indecisive character. So I was getting ready for a prudent retreat to my little bedroom at the top of the house, when the front door groaned on its hinges. Large feet made the wooden staircase creak, and the master of the house came through the dining room and burst into his study. On his hurried way through, though, he had thrown his nutcracker head cane in the corner, his broad hat brushed up the wrong way on the table, and ringing words to his nephew, Axel, I'm here. I hadn't had time to move before the professor shouted again, in a most impatient voice, Wiel. Are you not here yet? I rushed into my formidable master's study. Otto Leidenbrock was not a bad man, I will gladly concede. But unless changes happen to him, which is highly unlikely, he will die a terrible eccentric. He was a professor at the Johanneum, 6 and gave a course on mineralogy, during which he normally got angry at least once or twice. Not that for Leidenbrock, lit is German for eyelid, brocken, crumb, lump, of coal, or scrap, or to pluck, cf. also Leidenjar. 5 Axel, perhaps from axe, axes, also, lexa, words backwards. He was worried whether his students were assiduous at his lectures, or whether they paid attention, or whether they were successful later. He hardly bothered with these details. He lectured, subjectively, to use the expression from German philosophy, for himself and not for others. He was a learned egoist and a selfish scholar, a well of science whose handle groaned whenever someone wanted to draw something out of it, in a word, a miser. In Germany there are 1 or 2 professors like this. Unfortunately my uncle suffered from a slight pronunciation problem, if not in private, at least when speaking in public, a regrettable handicap for an orator. Thus, during his demonstrations at the Johanneum, often the professor would stop short. He would struggle with a recalcitrant word which his mouth refused to pronounce, one of those words which resist, swell up, and end up coming out in the unscientific form of a swear word. Then he would get very angry. Now, in mineralogy there are many learned words, half Greek, half Latin, and always difficult to pronounce, many unpolished terms that would scorch a poet's lips. I do not wish to criticize this science. Far from it. But when one is in the presence of rhombohedral crystallizations, ready asphalt resins, gelanites, fangicites, 7-lead molybdates, manganese tungstates, or zircon titanites, the most agile tongue is allowed to get tied in knots. The townspeople knew about this pardonable disability of my uncle's, and took unfair advantage. They watched out for the difficult sections, and he got furious, and they laughed, which is not in good taste, even for Germans. And if there was always a healthy attendance at Leidenbrock's lectures, how many followed them regularly simply in order to enjoy the professor's terrible outbursts? But despite all this, my uncle was an authentic scholar, I cannot emphasize this too much. Although he sometimes broke his samples by handling them too roughly, he combined the geologist's talent with the mineralogist's eye. With his mallet, his steel spike, his magnetic needle, his blowlamp, and his flask of nitric acid, he was highly gifted. From the frac appearance, resistance, melting point, sound, smell, and taste of any given mineral, he could put it without hesitation into any one of the 600 categories recognized by modern science. Leidenbrock's name was accordingly very much honored in the gymnasiums and learned societies. Sir Humphrey Davy, Humboldt, and Captains Franklin and Sabine made sure they visited him on their way. 6 The Johanneum, a famous classical grammar school, founded in Hamburg in 1529 and still in existence. 7 Gelanites, fangicites, neither word seems to be in the dictionaries. The first may even be Gelagnites. Jalinites is a variant spelling in French. 8 Davy, see note in ch. 6 Humboldt, Baron von Friedrich H. A. 1769–1859, German naturalist and traveler, also worked in Paris, author notably of Cosmos, 1845, an essay on the physical constitution of the globe. Franklin, Sir John, 1786–1847, British Arctic explorer, died after discovering Northwest Passage through Hamburg. Messrs. Becquerel, Ebelman, Brewster, Dumas, Milne Edwards, and St. Clair de Villeneuve liked to consult him on the most stimulating questions in chemistry. That science owed him some wonderful discoveries. In 1853 there had appeared in Leipzig a treatise upon transcendental crystallography by Professor O. Leidenbrock, printed in large folio pages with plates, but without covering its costs. Add to that my uncle was the curator of the Mineralogical Museum of Mr. Struve, the Russian ambassador, which was a valuable collection much esteemed throughout Europe. Such was the character calling for me so impatiently. Imagine a tall, thin man, with an iron constitution and youthful blonde hair that made him look a good 10 years younger than his 50. His big eyes darted incessantly around behind imposing glasses, his nose, long and thin, was like a sharpened blade, unkind people even claimed that it was magnetized, and picked up iron filings. Absolute slander, it only picked up snuff, but in raw air large quantities to tell the truth. If I add that my uncle took mathematical strides of exactly 3 feet, and that, while walking, he firmly clenched his fists, the sign of an impetuous temperament, then you will know him well enough not to wish to spend too much time in his company. He lived in his little house on Königstrasse, a half-wood, half-brick construction with a crenellated gable end. It looked out onto one of the winding canals that criss-cross in the center of the oldest part of Hamburg, fortunately unharmed by the fire of 1842. The old house leaned a little, it is true, it pushed its stomach out at the passers-by, and it wore its roof over one ear, like the cap of a 2-10 student. The harmony of its lines could have been better, then, but, all things considered, it held up well, thanks to an old elm, vigorously embedded in the facade, which, each springtime, used to push its flowering blossoms through the latticed windows. My uncle was not poor, not for a German professor. The house was entirely his, both building and contents. The latter consisted of his god as proved by an expedition later organized by his wife, Sabine, later General, Sir Edward, 1788-1883, British astronomer, accompanied Ross and Parry to Arctic 1818-20, specialist in terrestrial magnetism. 9 Becquerel, either Antoine César, 1788-1878, used electrolysis to isolate metals from their ores, or possibly his son and assistant Alexander Edmund, 1820-91, researched into solar radiation and diamagnetism. Ebelman, Verne, Ebelman, Jacques Joseph, 1814-52, French chemist who synthesized precious stones. Brewster, probably Sir David, 1781-1868, Scottish physicist, invented the kaleidoscope. Dumas, Jean-Baptiste André, 1800-84, French chemist, not ed for his research on vapor density and atomic weight. Milne Edwards, see note in ch. 37, St. Clair de Ville, Henri Etienne, 1818-81, chemist specializing in aluminum, and brother of Charles, 1814-76, French geologist and author of Eruptions Actuelles du Volcan de Stromboli. 10 Tugendbund, League of Virtue, 1808-16, daughter Grauben, a 17-year-old girl from Verland, 11 and Martha and myself. In my dual capacity as nephew and orphan, I had become the laboratory assistant for his experiments. I will admit that I devoured geological science with great relish, I had mineralogist's blood in my veins, and never felt bored in the company of my precious pebbles. In sum, life could be happy in this miniature house in Königstrasse, despite its owner's impatience, for, while setting about it in rather a rough manner, he did not love me any the less. But the man had never learned to wait, he was permanently in a hurry. When, in April, he planted heads of mignonette or morning glory in the china pots in his living room, he would go and pull their leaves each morning to make them grow faster. With such an eccentric, the only thing to do was to obey. I accordingly hurried into his study. To this study was a real museum. Specimens of the whole mineral order could be found here, labeled in the most perfect order, following the 3 grade divisions into inflammable, metallic, and lithoidal minerals. How well I knew them, these trinkets of mineralogical science, how many times, instead of wasting my time with boys of my own age, I had enjoyed dusting these graphites, these anthracites, these coals, these lignites, and these peats. The bitumens, the resins, the organic salts which had to be preserved from the least speck of dust. The metals, from iron to gold, whose relative value didn't count beside the absolute equality of scientific specimens. And all those stones, which would have been enough to rebuild the whole house in Königstrasse, even with a fine extra room, which would have suited me to a T. But when I went into the study, I was scarcely thinking about such wonders. My uncle formed the sole focus of my thoughts. He was buried in his large armchair covered with Utrecht velvet, holding a tome in both hands and studying it with the deepest admiration. What a book, what a book! He kept saying. This exclamation reminded me that Professor Leidenbrock was a fanatical book collector in his spare time. But a volume had no value in his eyes unless it was unfindable or, at the very least, unreadable. Well, he said, do you not see? It's a priceless gem I discovered this morning while poking around in the shop of Hevelius the Jew. Magnificent, I replied, with forced enthusiasm. 11 Grauben, Verne wrote Grauben throughout but, in line with normal German practice, this has been changed to Grauben, Graben, in English and in French, an elongated depression between geologic faults, grauen, horror, dread, Üben, to drill or exercise, from Verland. Verne's choice may be motivated by puns based on Verlandes and on Finland, the Scandinavian colony in N. America, c.1100, settled from Iceland plus vir, Latin for man, cf. Verl, it is Grauben who wears the trousers. What was the point of making such a fuss about an old quarto book whose spine and covers seemed to be made out of coarse vellum, a yellowish book from which hung a faded tassel? The professor's exclamations of admiration didn't stop, however. Look, he said, addressing both the questions and the replies to himself, isn't it beautiful? Yes, it's wonderful, and what a binding. Does the book open easily? Yes, it stays open at any page whatsoever. But does it close well? Yes, because the cover and leaves form a unified whole, without separating or gaping anywhere. And this spine, which does not have a single break after 700 years of existence. Oh, it's a binding to have made Bozerian, Klaus, or Pergold 12 proud. While speaking, my uncle was alternately opening and closing the old book. The only thing I could do was ask him about its contents, though they didn't interest me a single bit. And what's the title of this marvelous volume? I asked with ger and enthusiasm to be genuine. This work, replied my uncle, getting excited, is the Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson, 13, the famous 12th century Icelandic author. It is the chronicle of the Norwegian princes who ruled over Iceland. Really, I exclaimed as well as I could. It's presumably a German translation. What? The professor replied animatedly. A translation? What would I be doing with your translation? Who's bothered about your translation? This is the original work, in Icelandic, that magnificent language, both simple and rich, containing the most diverse grammatical combinations as well as numerous variations in the words. Like German. I slipped in, fortuitously. Yes, replied my uncle shrugging his shoulders, not to mention that Icelandic has 3 genders, like Greek, and declensions of proper nouns, like Latin. Ah, I said, my indifference a little shaken, and are the characters in this book handsome? Characters. Who's speaking of characters, benighted Axel? You did say, characters, did you not? Oh, so you are taking this for a printed book. Ignoramus, this is a manuscript, and a runic 14 manuscript at that. 12 Bozerian, Verne, Bozerian, 2 brothers who produced luxurious bindings in Paris at the time of Napoleon. Klaus and Pergold were also 19th century bookbinders. 13 Snorri Sturluson, 1179–1241, politician and historian, wrote a saga of Saint Olaf, rejecting some of the grosser hagiographical elements in his sources. This work forms the central part of his Heimskringla, the circle of the universe, chronicling Norse mythology and early history. At this time, books in Iceland were entirely made out of vellum, not just the covers. 14 Runic. Verne saw runic characters on stone inscriptions near Oslo in 1861. In 1875, he said that he based his runes on those of an illustration in El Univers Pittoresque. The characters here resemble only superficially the runes used in Scandinavia from about 450 to the 1200s, and in Anglo-Saxon Britain between runic. Yes. Are you now going to ask me to explain this word as well? There is certainly no need, I replied in the tone of a man wounded in his pride. But my uncle continued all the more, and told me things, despite my opposition, that I wasn't specially interested in knowing. Runes, he said, were handwritten characters formerly used in Iceland and, according to the tradition, were invented by Odin himself. But look, irreverent boy, admire these forms which sprang from a god's imagination. I swear that, having no other reply to give, I was going to prostrate myself, the sort of response that necessarily pleases gods and kings, because it has the advantage of never embarrassing them, when an incident happened to set the course of the conversation off on a different path. This was the appearance of a filthy parchment, which slid out of the book and fell to earth. My uncle rushed to pick up this knick-knack with an eagerness easy to understand. An old document locked up in an old book since time immemorial could not fail to have a signal value in his eyes. But what is it? He exclaimed. At the same time he carefully spread the parchment out on his desk. It was 5 inches long and 3 inches wide, with horizontal lines of mumbo-jumbo style characters written on it. The following is the exact facsimile. It is important that these bizarre forms be known, because they were to lead Professor Leidenbrock and his nephew to undertake the strangest expedition the 19th century has ever known. The professor examined the series of characters for a few moments. Then he said, lifting up his glasses, "They're runes, the forms are absolutely identical to those in Snorri Sturluson's manuscript. But what can it all mean? As runes seemed to me to be an invention by scholars to mystify the poor rest of the world, I wasn't displeased to see that my uncle didn't understand anything. At least, that seemed to be the case from his hands, which had begun to shake terribly. And yet it is old Icelandic," he muttered through clenched teeth. And Professor Leidenbrock surely knew what he was talking about, for he was reputed to be a genuine polyglot, not that he spoke fluently the 2,000 languages and 4,000 dialects employed on the surface of this globe, but he did know his fair share. Faced with such a difficulty, he was just about to give in to all the impulsiveness of his character, and I could foresee a violent scene, when 2 o'clock sounded on the wall clock over the mantelpiece. Martha immediately opened the study door, 650 and 1100. They were known to few people, hence were thought to have occult powers. "The soup is served." "The devil take your soup," shouted my uncle. "And the person who made it. And those who will drink it." Martha fled. I followed closely behind and, without knowing quite how, found myself sitting at my usual place in the dining room. I waited for a few moments, the professor didn't come. It was the first time, to my knowledge, that he was missing the ceremony of dinner. And what a dinner, moreover. Parsley soup, ham omelette with sorrel and nutmeg, loin of veal with plum sauce, 15 with, for pudding, prawns and sugar, the whole lot being washed down with a good moselle. That was what an old bit of paper was going to cost my uncle. By George, in my capacity as devoted nephew, I considered it my duty to eat for both him and me, which I did, very conscientiously. "I've never known such a thing," said Martha. Professor Leidenbrock not at table. "It's unbelievable. It portends some serious happening," said the old servant, shaking her head. In my opinion, it portended nothing at all, except for a terrible scene when my uncle found his dinner already eaten. I was just on the last prawn when a resounding voice called me from the delights of pudding. I was in the study in a single bound. 3. It's quite obviously runic, said the professor, knitting his brows. But there is a secret and I am going to discover it. If not. A violent gesture completed his thought. "Sit down," he added, indicating the table with his fist, "and write." In a moment I was ready. "Now I'm going to dictate the letter in our alphabet corresponding to each of the Icelandic characters. We will see what that gives. But, by God, be careful not to make a mistake." The dictation began. I concentrated as hard as I could. Each letter was spelled out one after the other, to form the incomprehensible succession of words that follows: RNLL Sesrul Seed SGTSSMF Untyfe Nijiki KT, Samnatrates SAODRRNM Nail Nuect Rilsa Atvar, NSCRCIEBS CCDRMI Utul Frantu DT, IACOC Boketti 15 Loin of veal with plum sauce, prawns and sugar. This would seem to be poking fun at the tendency of some northern nations to eat sweet things with meat. But it may also be a sign of the diabetes that Verne was later to contract. When this work was finished, my uncle eagerly snatched up the sheet on which I had been writing, and examined it for a long time with great care. "What does it mean?" he kept automatically repeating. I swear I couldn't have told him anything. In any case, he wasn't asking me and continued speaking to himself. "This is what we call a cipher, in which the meaning is hidden in letters which have deliberately been mixed up, and which, if properly laid out, would form an intelligible sentence. When I think that there is perhaps here the explanation or indication of a great discovery." For my part, I thought there was absolutely nothing, but kept my opinions carefully to myself. The professor then took the book and the parchment and compared them with each other. The two documents are not in the same hand. The cipher is posterior to the book, for I can see an immediate and irrefutable proof. The first letter is a double M16 that would be sought in vain in Sturluson's book, for it was added to the Icelandic alphabet only in the 14th century. So therefore at least 200 years elapsed between the manuscript and the document. That, I must admit, seemed quite logical. "I am therefore led to think," said my uncle, "that one of the owners of the book must have written out the mysterious characters. But who the devil was this owner? Might he not have inserted his name at some point in the manuscript?" My uncle lifted his glasses up, took a strong magnifying glass, and carefully worked his way over the first few pages of the book. On the back of the second one, the half-title page, he discovered a sort of stain, 17, which to the naked eye looked like an ink blot. However, looking closer, it was possible to distinguish a few half-erased characters. My uncle realized that this was the interesting part, so he concentrated on the blemish, and with the help of his big magnifying glass he ended up distinguishing the following symbols, runic characters which he spelled out without hesitation, 16 double M, the corresponding rune is which, as Leidenbrock says, is intended to equal a double M, whereas the other M's in the message are. The French edition, nevertheless, gives M.RNLLS. This has been corrected to MM.RNLLS, in the light of Verne's own transcription of on the next page, namely MM.17 stain. There is an anecdote, reported by Maurice Metrel in Sur les pas de Jules Verne, Neuchâtel, Nouvelle Bibliothèque, 1963, that Verne found the faded log book of a frigate captain called Pierre Lagourt. It had a blood stain on the last page, and he is meant to have often speculated what had happened to the author. But Metrel is often unreliable, and there is no supporting evidence for this story. Arn Saknussemm. 18 he cried in a triumphant voice. But that is a name to conjure with, and an Icelandic one at that, the name of a scholar of the 16th century, a celebrated alchemist. I looked at my uncle with a certain admiration. Those alchemists, Avicenna, Bacon, Lull, Paracelsus, 19 were the very table, nay the only, scholars of their time. They made discoveries at which we can reasonably be astonished. Why might this Saknussemm not have hidden some surprising invention in the incomprehensible cryptogram? That must be the case, that is the case. The professor's imagination caught fire at his assumption. Perhaps it is, I dared to reply. But what would be the point of a scholar hiding a marvelous discovery in such a way? Why? How should I know? Galileo, did he not act in this way for Saturn? 20 In any case, we shall soon see. I shall have the secret of this document, and will neither eat nor sleep until I have discovered it. Oh, I thought. Nor will you, Axel. My God, I thought to myself. What luck I ate for two. First of all, we must find out the language of this cipher, it cannot be difficult. At his words, I looked up quickly. My uncle continued his soliloquy, nothing could be easier. There are 132 letters in the document, of which 79 are consonants and 53 vowels. Now the southern languages conform approximately to this ratio, while the northern tongues are infinitely richer in consonants, it is therefore a language of the south. These conclusions were highly convincing. But what language is it? It was there that I expected to find a scholar, but discovered instead a deep analyst. This Saknussemm, he said, was an educated man. Now, when he was not writing in his mother tongue, he must naturally have chosen the language customarily used amongst educated people of the 16th 18 Arne Saknussemm, loosely based on Professor Arne Magnusson, 1663-1730, an Icelandic scholar, descended from Sturluson, who traveled on behalf of the King of Denmark to collect the manuscripts of the sagas, and who always wrote in Latin. Some of his material was destroyed during a fire at the University of Copenhagen in 1728. 19 Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, 980-1037, Islamic scientist and author of nearly 200 works. Bacon, Roger, 1220-92, English philosopher and scientist, studied optics and gunpowder, Franciscan, accused of dealing in black magic. Lull, Raymond Lully, or Lull, c.1232-1315, Spanish theologian and philosopher, author of the Lullian Method Towards Systematic Knowledge. Paracelsus, 1493-1541, Swiss healer, advocated folk and chemical remedies to illness, and investigated mining and minerals in the Tyrol. 20 Galileo, did he not act in this way for Saturn? Galileo's letter of 30 July 1610 used an anagram to hide the revelation that Saturn's ring was composed of two satellites, information kindly provided by Sidney Kravitz. Century, I refer to Latin. If I am proved wrong, I can try Spanish, French, Italian, Greek, or Hebrew. But the scholars of the 16th century generally wrote in Latin. I have therefore the right to say, a priori, that this is Latin. I almost jumped off my chair. My memories as a Latinist protested at the claim that this Baroque series of words could belong to the sweet language of Virgil. Yes, Latin, repeated my uncle, but Latin scrambled up. What a relief, I thought. If you can unscramble it again, you're a genius, uncle. Let's have a proper look at it, he said, again picking up the sheet on which I had written. This is a series of 132 letters presented in apparent disorder. There are words where the consonants are encountered on their own, like the first one, RNLLS, others in contrast where the vowels are abundant, for example the fifth word, untife, or the second but last one, osibo. Now the arrangement is clearly not deliberate. It is given mathematically by the unknown formula governing the succession of the letters. It seems certain to me that the original sentence must have been written normally, then jumbled up following a rule we have yet to discover. The person who got access to the key of the cipher would be able to read it fluently, but what is this key? Axel, do you have the key? To his question I replied nothing, and for a good reason. I was gazing at a charming portrait on the wall, one of Grauben. My uncle's ward was then in Altona, 21, staying with one of her relatives. Her absence made me very sad, because, I can admit it now, the pretty little Verland girl and the professor's nephew loved each other with all Germanic patience and calm. We had got engaged without my uncle knowing. He was too much of a geologist to understand such feelings. Grauben was a charming girl, blonde with blue eyes, of a slightly serious character, but she did not love me any the less for that. For my part, I adored her, if that is, the word exists in the Teutonic language. As a result of all this, the picture of my little Verland girl immediately switched me from the world of reality to that of daydreams, that of memories. I was watching the faithful companion of my work and pleasure. Each day she helped me organize my uncle's precious stones, and labeled them with me. Miss Grauben was a very fine mineralogist. She would have borne comparison with more than one scholar, for she loved getting to the bottom of the driest scientific questions. How many charming hours we had spent studying together, and how often I had been jealous of the fate of the unfeeling stones that she had manipulated with her graceful hands. Then, when the time for recreation had come, the two of us would go out. We used to walk through the bushy paths of the Ulster 22 and Head 21. Altona, Sartre's Les Sequestres d'Altona, 1959, was set here, and the stage directions indicate a 19th-century room. In the autobiographical Les Mots, 1963, Sartre repeatedly emphasizes his early passion for Verne. 22. The Ulster joins the Elbe in Hamburg, together for the old tar-covered mill which looked so fine at the far end of the lake. On the way we would chat while holding hands. I would tell her things and she would laugh heartily at them. In this way we would arrive on the banks of the Elbe, then, having said good night to the swans gliding around amongst the great white water lilies, we would come back by steam ferry to the quayside. I was just at this point in my daydream when my uncle, hitting the table with his fist, brought me violently back to reality. Let's see, he said. In order to mix up the letters of a sentence, it seems to me that the first idea to come into one's mind ought to be to write the words vertically instead of horizontally. Clever, I thought. We must see what it produces. Axel, write any sentence at all on this scrap of paper, but, instead of writing the letters one after the other, put them in vertical columns made up of groups of 5s or 6s. I understood what was required and immediately wrote from top to bottom, IYYLULOLEBOUIGEVTRNEMTA. Good, said the professor without reading it. Now write these words in a horizontal line. I did so and obtained the following sentence, IYYLULEBOUIGEVTRNEMTA. Perfect, said my uncle, tearing the paper out of my hands. This is beginning to look like the old document. The vowels and the consonants are both grouped together in the same confusion. There are even capitals in the middle of the words, and commas as well, just as in Saknussemm's parchment. I couldn't help thinking that these remarks were highly ingenious. Now, said my uncle again, addressing me directly, in order to read the sentence that you have just written and which I do not know, all I have to do is take the first letter of each successive word, then the second letter, then the third, and so on. And my uncle, to his great amazement and even more to mine, read out, I love you, my little Grauben. Said the professor. Yes, without being aware of it, awkwardly in love, I had written out this compromising sentence. Oh, so you're in love with Grauben, are you? Said my uncle in an authentic guardian's tone. Yes. No. I spluttered. So you do love Grauben, he said mechanically. Well, let's apply my procedure to the document in question. My uncle had returned to his engrossing ideas and had already forgotten my risky words. I say, risky, because the scholar's mind could never understand the matters of the heart. But fortunately, the vital question of the document took precedence. Just before performing his critical experiment, Professor Leidenbrock's eyes were throwing sparks out through his glasses. His hands trembled as he picked the old parchment up again. He was profoundly excited. Finally he coughed loudly, and in a solemn voice, calling out successively the first letter of each word, then the second, he dictated the following series to me, Misunkasenra.isftic.segnidamertanisertseret rotevadua, ednexedsedna lakartnialuj meritarxalukoislefens nl. When he had finished, I will admit that I was excited. These letters, called out one after another, had not produced any meaning in my mind. I was therefore waiting for the professor to produce pompously from his mouth a sentence of Latin majesty. But who could have foreseen it? A violent blow from his fist shook the table. The ink spurted, the pen jumped from my hands. That's not it, shouted my uncle. It makes no sense. Then, crossing the study like a cannonball and going downstairs like an avalanche, he threw himself into Königstrasse and shot off at a rate of knots. 4. Has he gone out? Shouted Martha, running up at the slam of the front door, which had just shaken the house to its very foundations. Yes, completely gone. But what about his dinner? He's not having any. And his supper? No supper either. Clasping her hands, pardon. Yes, Martha, he's given up food, and so has the entire household. Uncle Leidenbrock has put us all on a strict diet until he's deciphered a piece of old mumbo-jumbo that is totally undecipherable. Goodness, we'll all die of starvation. I didn't dare admit that with such an uncompromising individual as my uncle, this fate seemed nigh uncertain. The old servant went back into the kitchen, looking very worried and muttering. Alone again, I thought of going to tell Grauben everything. But how could I get out of the house? The professor might come back at any moment. What if he summons me? Or if he wanted to start work again on that word puzzle which even old Oedipus couldn't have solved. 23. And if I wasn't there when he called for me, what might happen then? It was safest to stay put. As it happened, a mineralogist from Besançon had just sent us a collection of silicious geodes that needed sorting out. I set to work. I classified these hollow stones with their little crystals moving inside, I prepared labels, I arranged them in the presentation cases. But this activity didn't require all my concentration. The problem of the old document wouldn't stop disturbing me in a most peculiar fashion. My head was swirling and I felt vaguely anxious. I had the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. An hour later, my geodes were stacked in neat little rows. I fell into the massive Utrecht armchair, my arms lolling over the sides and my head leaning back. I lit my pipe, the one with the long curved stem and the bowl carved into a casually reclining water nymph, and then had great fun watching it burn, slowly converting my nymphette into an unalloyed negress. From time to time I listened out for steps hammering up the stairs. But none came. Where could my uncle be at this moment? I imagined him running around under the splendid trees on the Altona road, waving his arms, firing at the walls with his walking stick, flattening the grass at a stroke, beheading the thistles, disturbing the lonely storks from their sleep. Would he come back triumphant or discouraged? Who would win, him or the secret? I was wondering about such matters, and without thinking picked up the sheet of paper on which I had written the incomprehensible sequence of letters. I repeated to myself, what can it possibly mean? I tried to group the letters into words. I couldn't. Whether you put them into 2s, 3s, 5s, or 6s, nothing came out that made sense. The 14th, 15th, and 16th letters did produce the English word ice. The 84th, 85th, and 86th ones gave sir. In the middle of the document, in the third line, 24, I spotted the Latin words rota, mutable, ira, nec, and atra. It's amazing. These last few words seem to confirm my uncle's view about the language of the document. In the fourth line I can even see Luco, which means sacred wood. It's true that the third line also includes tabald, which sounds completely Hebrew to me, and the last one, mer, arc, and mir, pure and unadulterated French. It was enough to drive you out of your mind. 4 different languages in the same preposterous sentence. What possible connection could there be between ice, sir, anger, cruel, sacred wood, changeable, mother, bow, and sea? Only the first and last were easily linked. In a document written in Iceland, it was hardly surprising that there should be a sea of ice. But putting the rest of the puzzle back together was another matter entirely. 23. That word puzzle, solved. Part of Oedipus's quest was to solve a riddle set him by the Sphinx. 24. In the third line, in fact, in the second and third lines, I was struggling with an insoluble problem. My brain started overheating, my eyes blinking at the sheet. The 132 letters seemed to dance around me, like those silver drops which float above your head when there is a sudden rush of blood to it. I was having a sort of hallucination, I was suffocating, I needed some fresh air. Absent-mindedly I fanned myself using the piece of paper, with the back and the front passing alternately before my eyes. Imagine my surprise when I thought I caught sight of perfectly intelligible words during a quick turn of the sheet, just as the other side came into view, Latin words like craterum and terrester. Suddenly my mind sparked. Through the fleeting glimpses I had caught sight of the truth. I had discovered how the code worked. To understand the document, you didn't even need to read it through the paper. Far from it. In its original form, exactly as it had been spelled out to me, it could easily be decoded. The professor's ingenious attempts were all finally paying off. He had been right about the way the letters were arranged and right about the language the document was written in. A mere nothing, 25 had stopped him reading the Latin sentence from beginning to end, and this self-same nothing had just fallen into my lap by pure chance. You can imagine how excited I felt. My eyes went out of focus and I couldn't see anything. I had spread the piece of paper out on the table. All I had to do now to possess the secret was to glance at it. At last I managed to calm down. I forced myself to walk round the room twice to settle my nerves, then came back and immersed myself again in the huge armchair. I drew a large supply of air into my lungs, and shouted, "Read on." I bent over the table. I placed my finger on each successive letter and, without stopping, without slowing down at all, read the whole message out loud. What amazement, what terror entered my soul. At first it was like being hit by a blow you didn't expect. What, had the things I had just discovered really happened? A man had been daring enough to penetrate. No. I cried indignantly. No. I'm not going to tell my uncle. It would be terrible if he got to know about such a journey. He'd just want to have a go himself. Nothing would stop a geologist of such determination. He would leave anyway, against all obstacles, whatever the cost. And he'd take me with him, and we wouldn't come back. Never. Not know how. I was in an awful state, one difficult to describe. No, no, no. It won't happen like that, I said firmly. And since I am able to prevent any such idea crossing the mind of the dictator who governs my life, I will do so. By turning this document in every direction, he might accidentally discover the code. I'm going to destroy it. The fire hadn't quite gone out. I picked up the sheet of paper, together with Saknussemm's parchment. My trembling hand was just about to 25 a mere nothing. French, rien, nothing, in medieval Latin is rem, which is not only the ending of craterum, but also the previously quoted mer, see, backwards, throw the whole lot onto the coals and thus destroy the dangerous secret. When the study door opened, my uncle came in. I had barely time to put the wretched document back on the desk. Professor Leidenbrock seemed preoccupied. His obsessive idea wasn't giving him a moment's rest. He had obviously pondered the question during his walk, considered it, called on every resource of his imagination. And he had plainly come back to try out some new combination. Sure enough, he sat down in his armchair and, pen in hand, began to write out formulae that looked like algebraic calculations. I watched his frantic hand, not a single movement was lost on me. Was some surprising new result suddenly going to spring forth? I was afraid it would, irrationally, since the correct combination, the only one, had already been discovered, and so any other line of exploration was doomed to failure. For 3 long hours, my uncle worked without a word, without looking up, rubbing out, starting again, crossing out, setting to for the umpteenth time. I knew full well that if he managed to put the letters into every single order possible, then the right sentence would come out. But I also knew that a mere 20 letters can form 2 quintillion, 432 quadrillion, 902 trillion, 8 billion, 176,640,000 combinations. In fact, there were 132 letters in the sentence, and these 132 letters produced a total number of sentences that had at least 133 digits, 26, one that is virtually impossible to enumerate and goes completely beyond the bounds of imagination. I therefore felt reassured about the heroic way of solving the problem. But time passed, night came, the street noises died down, my uncle, still bent over his work, didn't see anything, didn't notice Martha half opening the door. He heard nothing, not even the voice of the faithful servant, "Will sir be having supper tonight?" Martha had to go away again without a response. As for myself, after fighting it for some time, an irresistible drowsiness came over me, and I fell asleep on the end of the sofa, while my uncle Leidenbrock continued his adding up, his taking away, and his crossing out. When I woke again the following morning, the inexorable worker was still at it. His eyes were red, his face pale, his hair tousled by a feverish hand, and his cheekbones glowed purple. All were signs of a terrible struggle with the impossible, showing what tiredness of mind and what exertions of the brain must have filled the long hours. 20 letters, 133 digits, the figure for 20 letters, 20 factorial, is correct, provided that all 20 letters are different, but 132 factorial has in fact 125 digits. I was genuinely sorry for him. In spite of the reproaches I probably had the right to make, I felt considerable pity. The poor man was so possessed by his idea that he had quite forgotten to be angry. His whole energy was concentrated on a single point, and since it could not escape through its normal outlet, it was to be feared that it might simply explode at any moment. With a single act one could undo the iron hoop wrapped tight round his brain, with just one word. I did nothing. But I had a kind heart. Why did I not speak out in such circumstances? For my uncle's own sake. No, no, I repeated, no. I'm not going to say anything. He would only want to go there, I know him, nothing would stop him. He has a volcanic imagination and he would risk his life to do what no geologist has ever done before. I will not say anything, I will keep this secret given to me by chance. To let it out would be tantamount to killing Professor Leidenbrock. Let him guess if he can. I don't want to feel responsible one day for having sent him to his death. Once my mind was made up, I crossed my arms and waited. But I hadn't reckoned with something that happened a few hours later. When Martha tried to go out to the market, she found the door locked. The big key was not in the keyhole. Who had taken it out? Obviously my uncle, when he had come back from his hasty excursion the day before. Was it on purpose? Or was it through absent-mindedness? Did he want us to feel real hunger pains? That seemed to be going a bit far. Why should Martha and I suffer because of a situation that had nothing whatsoever to do with us? But apparently this was the case, and I recalled a frightening precedent. A few years before, when my uncle had been working on his grand mineral classification, he had remained 48 hours without eating, and his whole household had had to follow his scientific diet. As a result, I acquired stomach cramps that were not much fun for a boy of a fairly ravenous nature. It now seemed that breakfast was going to go the same way as supper the day before. Nevertheless, I resolved to be heroic and not to give in to the demands of hunger. Martha took it very seriously. She was inconsolable, the poor woman. As for myself, being unable to leave the house upset me more, with good reason, as I am sure you will understand. My uncle was still working, his mind was lost in a world of combinations, he lived far from the earth and truly beyond worldly needs. At about 12 o'clock, though, hunger began to cause me serious problems. Martha, very innocently, had devoured the supplies in the larder the day before, and so there was nothing left in the whole house. I held on, however. I considered it a matter of honor. 2 o'clock chimed. The situation was becoming ridiculous, intolerable even. My eyes began to look very big. I started to tell myself that I was exaggerating the importance of the document, that in any case my uncle wouldn't believe what it said, that he would regard it as a mere practical joke, that if the worst came to the worst he could be restrained against his will if he wanted to attempt the expedition, and that he might easily find the code himself, in which case all my efforts at abstinence would have been in vain. These all seemed excellent reasons to me, although I would have indignantly rejected them the day before. I even considered it a terrible mistake to have waited so long, and I made up my mind to reveal all. I was therefore looking for a way into the subject, one that wasn't too sudden, when, without warning, the professor stood up, put his hat on, and got ready to go out. What, leave the house, and shut us in again? Never. Uncle. He didn't appear to have heard. Uncle Leidenbrock. I repeated, raising my voice. Huh, he said, like someone abruptly woken up. What about the key? What key? The door. No, I cried. The key to the document. The professor scrutinized me over his glasses. He must have noticed something unusual in my face, for he firmly grabbed me by the arm while still carefully inspecting me, although unable to utter a word. All the same, never was a question asked more clearly. I moved my head up and down. He shook his, with a sort of pity, as if dealing with a lunatic. I made a more positive sign. His eyes shone brighter, his hand became threatening. Given the situation, this silent conversation would have absorbed the most indifferent spectator. I had in fact really reached the point of not daring to say anything, such was my fear of my uncle suffocating me when he first began to joyfully embrace me. But he became so insistent that I just had to speak. Yes, the code. Purely by chance. What are you saying? He cried with an intensity that cannot be described. Look, I said, giving him the paper with my writing on. Read. But it doesn't make sense. He replied, screwing it up. No sense when you begin at the beginning, but. I hadn't finished before the professor produced a shout, more than a shout, an actual roar. A revelation had just occurred in his brain. His face was transmogrified. Oh, clever old Saknussemm. He bellowed. So you wrote your MES sage backwards. And throwing himself on the sheet of paper, his eyes unfocused, his voice trembling, he spelled the whole document out, working his way from the last letter back to the first. 2727 from, first, Verne probably derived this method of constructing a cryptogram from Poe's The Gold Bug, which he quotes extensively in his Edgar Poe et Ses Uvers, 1864. This was what he read, in Sneffels Joculus craterum chem delibat umbra scarteris Julii intra calendas descent, autus viator, et terrester centrum attinges. Kodfeci. Arn Saknussemm, which, when translated from the Dog Latin, reads as follows: Go down into the crater of Snæfellsjökull which the shadow of Scartaris caresses before the calends 28 of July, O audacious traveler, and you will reach the center of the earth. I did it. Arn Saknussemm. As he read, my uncle jumped as if drawing current from a Leyden jar. 29 His courage, his joy, his certainty, knew no bounds. He walked up and down, he held his head in both hands, he moved the chairs around, he piled the books up, unbelievably, he juggled with his precious geodes, he threw a punch here, a blow there. At last his nerves calmed down and, like a man exhausted after discharging too much fluid, he flopped back in his armchair. So what time is it? He asked after a few moments' silence. 3 o'clock. Dinner has gone down quickly. I'm dying of hunger. To table. And then after that. After. You can pack my trunk. Single quote ? Single quote. And yours too. Concluded the merciless professor, striding into the dining room. These last words sent a shiver through my whole body. I kept my self-control though. I even resolved to put on a brave face. Only scientific arguments could stop Professor Leidenbrock now. And there was no lack of arguments, and good ones, against such a journey being possible. Go to the center of the earth. What madness. But I kept my reasoning for a more suitable moment, and instead gave my full attention to the meal. There would be little point in reproducing here my uncle's curses when he saw the cleared-away table. Things were duly explained to him, and Martha freed again. Running to the market, she managed so well that an hour later my hunger was satisfied, and I could begin to be aware of the situation once more. During the meal, my uncle had been almost cheerful, there escaped from him some of those scholars' jokes that never become really dangerous. After the last course, he beckoned me into his study. I obeyed. He sat at one side of his desk, with me at another. Axel, he said in a voice that was almost kindly, you are a highly gifted boy, you were of great assistance to me when I was worn out by my efforts and about to give up looking for the combination. Where would I 28 calends, the first day of the month in the Roman calendar? 29 Leyden jar, a kind of electrical condenser with a glass jar as a dielectric between sheets of tin foil, invented in 1745 at Leiden University, have ended up. No one can guess. I will never forget that, my boy, and you will have your fair share of the fame we are going to achieve. Now's my chance. I thought. He's in a good mood, the moment to discuss the aforementioned fame. Single quote. Above all, my uncle continued, total secrecy must be maintained, do you hear? In the scientific world, there is no shortage of people jealous of me, and many of them would dearly love to tackle this journey. But they will have no inkling of it until we get back. Do you really believe there'd be so many takers? Most definitely. Who would think twice about gaining such celebrity? If people knew of the document, a whole army of geologists would rush to follow in Arne Saknussemm's footsteps. That's where I'm not totally convinced, uncle, for nothing proves that the manuscript is genuine. What? In the book we discovered it in. All right, I accept that this Saknussemm wrote the message, but does it necessarily follow that he actually carried out the journey? Couldn't the old parchment just be a practical joke? I half regretted this last idea, admittedly a bit daring. The professor's thick eyebrows frowned, and I was afraid that the rest of the conversation might not go as I wished. But fortunately it didn't turn out like that. A sort of smile played over my stern questioner's lips, as he replied, that is what we are going to find out. I said, a little annoyed. Allow me first to exhaust all possible objections concerning the document. Speak, my boy, give yourself full rein. I grant you every freedom to express your opinion. You are no longer my nephew, but my colleague. Pray proceed. Well, I will first ask you what Jokul, Snæfellsnes, and Skartaris mean, since I have never even heard of them. That's easy. As it happens, I received a map not very long ago from my friend August Petermann of Leipzig. 30. It couldn't have arrived at a better time. Take down the third atlas on the second section in the big bookcase, Series Z, Shelf 4. I got up and, thanks to the precise instructions, quickly found the required atlas. My uncle opened it. This is Anderson's, one of the best maps of Iceland, and it may easily provide us with solutions to all your problems. I leant over the map. See this island of volcanoes, said the professor, and notice that they all bear the name, Jokul. This means glacier, in Icelandic, and, at that northerly latitude, most of the eruptions reach the light of day through the layers of ice. Hence this name, Jokul, applied to all the fire-producing peaks of the island. Fine. But what about Snæfellsnes? The 30th of August Petermann of Leipzig, Verne, Augustus Petermann, 1822-78, cartographer and geographer, in fact from Hamburg and Gotha. I hoped there would be no answer to this question. I was wrong. Follow me along the western coast of Iceland. Do you see Reykjavik, the capital? Yes. Good. Work your way up along the countless fjords of these shorelines eaten by the sea, and stop a little before the line of 65 degrees north. What do you see? A peninsula rather like a bare bone, with an enormous kneecap at the end. Not an inappropriate comparison, my dear boy. Now, do you see anything on the kneecap? Yes, a mountain that looks as if it's sprouted in the middle of the sea. Good. That's Snaefell's. Snaefell's. The one and only. A 5,000-foot high mountain, one of the most remarkable on the island, and definitely the most famous in the whole world, if its crater leads to the center of the globe. But it's quite impossible, I said, shrugging my shoulders in protest at such a conjecture. Impossible, said Professor Leidenbrock severely. And why should that be? Because this crater is obviously blocked up with lava and scorching rocks, and so. And supposing it is an extinct crater. Extinct. Yes. There are now only about 300 volcanoes in activity on the surface of the Earth, but the number of extinct ones is much greater. Snaefell's falls into this latter category, and in historical times has only had a single eruption, the 1219 one. Since then its rumblings have gradually died down, and it is no longer considered an active volcano. I had no reply at all for these categorical statements, so fell back on the other mysteries hidden in the document. But what does the word Scartaris mean, and what have the calends of July got to do with anything? My uncle concentrated for a few seconds. My hope came back for a moment, but only for a moment, for soon he replied to me as follows: what you call a mystery is crystal clear for me. It proves with what care and ingenuity Saknussemm wished to indicate his discovery. Snaefell's is composed of several craters, it was therefore necessary to pinpoint which is the one that leads to the center of the globe. What did our scholarly Icelander do? Our Icelandic scholar observed that as the calends of July approached, that is towards the end of June, one of the mountain peaks, called Scartaris, cast its shadow as far as the opening of the relevant crater, and he noted this fact in his document. Could he have found a more precise indication, and, once we are on the summit of Snaefell's, can there be a moment's hesitation as to the path to follow? Decidedly my uncle had an answer for everything. I saw full well that he was unassailable on the words of the ancient parchment. So I stopped pressing him on that subject and, since the most important thing was to convince him, turned to the scientific objections, in my view much more serious. All right, I am forced to accept that Saknussemm's message is clear and can leave no doubt in one's mind. I even grant that the document looks perfectly authentic. So this scholar went to the bottom of Snaefell's, he saw the shadow of Scartaris lingering on the edge of the crater just before the calends of July, he probably even heard the people of his time recounting legends that this crater led to the center of the Earth. But as to whether he went down there himself, whether he carried out the journey and came back, whether he even undertook it, no, 100 times no. And the reason? Asked my uncle in a singularly mocking tone. Because all the scientific theories demonstrate that such an undertaking is impossible. All the theories say that, replied the professor, putting on a good-natured appearance. Oh, the nasty theories. They're going to get terribly in our way, the poor theories. I could see that he was making fun of me, but continued regardless. Yes, it is well known that the temperature increases by approximately 1 degree centigrade for every 70 feet you go below the surface of the globe. Now, assuming that this ratio remains constant, and given that the radius of the Earth is about 4,000 miles, 31, the temperature at the center will be well over 200,000 degrees. The substances at the Earth's core exist, therefore, as white-hot gases, for even metals like gold or platinum, even the hardest rocks, cannot resist such a temperature. My question whether it is possible to travel in such an environment is consequently a reasonable one. So, Axel, it is the heat that bothers you. Certainly. If we were to attain a depth of only 25 miles, we would have reached the limit of the Earth's crust, for the temperature would already be more than 1,400 degrees. And you are afraid of melting. I leave the question for you to decide, I replied sharply. Here is what I decide, said Professor Leidenbrock, assuming an important air. It is that neither you nor anyone else knows for certain what happens in the Earth's interior, given that scarcely a 12,000th part of its radius is known. It is that science is eminently perfectible, and that each existing theory is constantly replaced by a new one. Was it not believed before Fourier 32 that the temperature of interplanetary space 31 4,000 miles can sense lose in ch 39, the same can sense lose is given as the distance still to go. In ch 25, the radius at the latitude of Iceland is given more exactly as can cent 83 at UNTA's 3,936 miles. If a French league is taken to be exactly 4 kilometers, the modern figure for the equatorial radius is 3,963 miles. 32 Fourier, Jean-Baptiste Joseph, 1768-1830. Known today as a mathematician for the Fourier series, his work was carried out on heat diffusion, which led him to invent the idea of partial differential equations, went down indefinitely, and is it not known now that the greatest cold in the ether does not go beyond 40 or 50 degrees below zero? Why should it not be the same for the internal heat? Why should it not encounter at a certain depth a limit that cannot be crossed, instead of reaching the point where the most obdurate minerals liquefy? Since my uncle placed the question on the terrain of hypotheses, I had no reply to make. Well, Axel, I can tell you that real scientists, amongst them Poisson, 33, have proved that if a temperature of 200,000 degrees actually existed inside the globe, the white-hot gases produced by the fusion of the solids would acquire such force that the Earth's crust could not resist and would explode like the walls of a boiler under steam pressure. Poisson's opinion, uncle, that's all. Agreed, but it is also the opinion of other distinguished geologists that the interior of the globe is not formed of gas, nor of water, nor of the heaviest rocks that we know. The reason is that, if it were, the Earth would only weigh half as much as it does. Oh, you can prove anything you want with figures. And can you, my boy, with facts? Is it not true that the number of volcanoes has considerably decreased since the first days of the world? 34. And if there is indeed heat in the center, can one not deduce that it is also tending to diminish? Uncle, if you're entering the realm of suppositions, there is nothing more I can say. And I have to say that my opinion is shared by highly competent figures. Do you remember a visit that the famous British chemist Sir Humphrey Davy paid me in 1825? 35. Hardly, as I only came into the world 19 years later. Well, Sir Humphrey came to see me as he was passing through Hamburg. Amongst other things, we had a long discussion about the hypothesis that the innermost core of the Earth was liquid. We both agreed that a molten state could not exist, for a reason to which science has never found a response. What reason is that? I said, slightly stunned. Because the liquid mass would be subject, like the ocean, to the moon's attraction, thus producing internal tides twice a day which would push up at the Earth's crust and cause regular earthquakes. But it is none the less obvious that the surface of the globe was once exposed to combustion, and one can suppose that the outer crust cooled down first while the heat retreated to the center. 33. Poisson, Siméon Denis, 1781–1840, applied mathematician at the Sorbonne. Known today for the Poisson distribution in statistics. 34. The first days of the world, a hangover from biblical language. 35. Sir Humphrey Davy, 1778–1829. Chemist, notably discovered laughing gas, invented miner's safety lamp and proved that diamond was a form of carbon. 1825, Leidenbrock is, about 50, in 1863, ch. 1, which makes him about 12 in 1825. Not so. The Earth heated up through combustion on its surface, not from any other cause. The surface was composed of a great quantity of metals such as potassium and sodium, which have the property of catching fire as soon as they are in contact with air and water. These metals started to burn when the water vapor in the atmosphere fell to the ground as rain. Little by little, as the water worked its way into the cracks in the Earth's crust, it produced further fires, explosion, and eruptions. Hence the large number of volcanoes during the first days of the world. What an ingenious hypothesis! I cried, rather in spite of myself. Which Sir Humphrey brought to my notice by means of a highly simple experiment on this very spot. He constructed a ball made mainly of the metals I have just mentioned, and which perfectly represented our globe. When a fine dew was dropped onto its surface, it blistered, oxidized, and produced a tiny mountain. A crater opened at the summit, an eruption took place, and it transmitted so much warmth to the whole ball that it became too hot to hold.